We're talking man-in-the-middle attacks. Mid-M, for short.
Ah, yes, mid-M attacks. A classic but always evolving threat.
It's like something straight out of a spy movie.
Yeah, someone tapping a phone line, listening in on a crucial conversation. Except in this case, it's your internet connection that's being tapped.
Exactly. And the stakes are high. We're talking about stolen data, financial losses, even disruption of entire businesses and industries.
You hit the nail on the head. It's not just a Hollywood plot device anymore. These attacks are happening every day, and they can have devastating consequences.
Okay, so before we get too deep into the weeds, let's start with the basics. For our listeners who might not be cybersecurity experts, could you explain what exactly a man-in-the-middle attack is?
In the simplest terms, a man-in-the-middle attack is where a hacker inserts themselves into a conversation between two parties without them knowing.
Okay, so they're like the invisible eavesdropper.
Precisely. They're secretly listening in on your communication and potentially even manipulating it.
And this happens online, right?
Yeah.
Not literally tapping into phone lines.
Right. It all happens in the digital realm. Think of it this way. You're sending an email, buying something online, maybe doing some banking. You think you're communicating directly with the other party, but a hacker using a mid-M attack could be sitting right in the middle, intercepting every bit of data that's going back and forth.
Like a digital middleman.
Exactly. And they can not only steal your sensitive information like login credentials and credit card numbers, but they can also alter the data you see or even redirect you to a fake website designed to steal your information.
Okay, that's already giving me chills. I'm picturing someone peering over my shoulder as I type in my password.
It's a good way to visualize it because the threat is real and it's something everyone needs to be aware of.
Before we dive into the technical details, I'd love to give our listener a concrete example, something they can really relate to.
Sure. Let's say you're at a coffee shop using their free Wi-Fi. You decide to check your bank account. You log in, everything seems normal. But what you don't know is that a hacker has set up a rogue Wi-Fi network that looks just like the coffee shop's legitimate one.
Oh, so you're saying I might not even be connecting to the real Wi-Fi network.
Exactly. That's one of the tricks hackers use to carry out these attacks. They create fake networks that are designed to lure unsuspecting victims.
So once you connect to that rogue network,
The hacker can see everything you're doing. They can capture your username, your password, any sensitive information you enter.
so that free Wi-Fi might come at a hidden cost.
Unfortunately, yes. And it's not just public Wi-Fi. Mid-M attacks can happen on any network, even your home network, if it's been compromised.
So no one is really safe.
That's why it's so important to understand how these attacks work and what you can do to protect yourself.
You mentioned compromised home networks. How does that even happen?
Well, there are a lot of ways a hacker can gain access to your home network. They could exploit a vulnerability in your router or modem. They could trick you into installing malware on your computer. Or they could even use social engineering tactics to get you to reveal your passwords.
Wow, it's like they always have a trick up their sleeve.
Exactly. They're constantly coming up with new ways to infiltrate our systems.
It's scary stuff.
Yeah.
But I'm glad we're talking about it so people can be aware of the risks.
Awareness is the first step to protection.
Okay, so we know that hackers can use rogue Wi-Fi networks to carry out mid-M attacks. What other tricks do they have up their sleeves?
Oh, there's a whole arsenal of techniques they use. One common one is DNS spoofing. Have you heard of that?
I've heard the term, but I'm not sure I fully understand it.
It's a bit technical, but I'll try to explain it simply. Think of DNS as like a phone book for the internet.
Okay, I'm following so far.
When you type in a website address like google.com, your computer needs to figure out the actual IP address to connect to. That's where DNS comes in. It translates the website address into a numerical IP address that computers can understand.
So it's like a directory service for the internet.
Exactly. Now, in a DNS spoofing attack, a hacker essentially poisons this phone book. They redirect your request to a fake website that looks almost identical to the real one.
So you think you're going to google.com, but you're actually being sent to a malicious website controlled by the hacker.
Precisely. And these fake websites can be very convincing. They often mimic the look and feel of the legitimate site to trick even savvy users.
It's like a digital bait and switch.
Exactly. You think you're on a trusted website, but you're actually handing over your login credentials and other sensitive information to a hacker.
That's terrifying. So what can people do to protect themselves from DNS spoofing?
We'll get into the specific protection tips a little later, but one simple thing you can do is to always double-check the website address in your browser's address bar. Make sure it's spelled correctly and that it's the actual website you intended to visit.
Okay, so be vigilant. Pay attention to the details.
Exactly. Don't rush through online transactions and always double-check the website address before entering any sensitive information.
You mentioned another technique earlier session, hijacking. What's that all about?
This one's all about cookies, but
What?
not the delicious kind, unfortunately.
Uh-huh. I was just thinking about chocolate chip cookies.
These are browser cookies, small text files that websites store on your computer to remember you and keep you logged in.
Oh, right. I've seen those pop up before.
In a session hijacking attack, a hacker steals these cookies, giving them access to your active sessions on websites.
So even if I have a strong password,
They can essentially slip in and take over your account without you even realizing it.
it's like they're stealing your digital identity.
In a way, yes. They're gaining unauthorized access to your accounts, and they can use that access to do all sorts of damage.
So we've talked about rogue Wi-Fi networks, DNS spoofing session hijacking. What else should people be worried about?
Well, those are some of the most common techniques, but the methods are always evolving. Hackers are constantly coming up with new and creative ways to carry out these attacks.
It's like a constant cat and mouse game.
Exactly.
Hey, wait a
And
minute.
that's why it's so important to stay informed about the latest threats and to be proactive about your cybersecurity.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about prevention. Before we get into specific tips, I'm curious, how can our listener even know if they're being targeted by a mid-M attack? Are there any warning signs?
There are definitely some red flags to watch out for. One of the most important is to pay attention to the website address. Look for the HTTPS at the beginning of the URL and make sure there's a padlock icon in your browser's address bar.
Okay, HTTPS and the padlock.
Got it.
What else?
Pay close attention to any unusual network activity. If your internet connection suddenly becomes slow or unstable, or you experience unexpected disconnections, it could be a sign that someone is interfering with your traffic.
So basically trust your gut. If your internet is acting wonky, it could be a sign of trouble.
Exactly. And if you see any unusual pop-ups or warnings from your browser, don't ignore them.
Especially those warnings about invalid security certificates.
Exactly. Those are often a sign that something is amiss.
So those are some of the red flags. But let's talk solutions. What can our listener do to protect themselves from becoming a victim of one of these attacks? I'm assuming a tinfoil hat won't cut it.
I'm afraid not. While tinfoil hats might be fashionable, they won't offer much protection in the digital world.
Okay, so what will?
One of the most effective ways to protect yourself from mid-M attacks is to use a VPN.
A VPN? I've heard that term thrown around a lot, but I'm not sure I fully understand what it is or how it works.
A VPN stands for Virtual Private Network, and it's essentially a secure tunnel that encrypts your internet traffic.
Okay, encryption, that sounds good. But how does it actually work?
When you connect to a VPN, your internet traffic is routed through a server operated by the VPN provider. That server acts as a middleman between your device and the internet. So instead of your internet traffic going directly from your computer to the website you're trying to access, it goes through the VPN server first.
So it's like putting all my online activity in a secure envelope.
That's a good analogy. The VPN encrypts your data so that even if a hacker intercepts it, they won't be able to read it.
So it's like speaking in code.
Exactly. Even if someone is listening in, they won't be able to understand what you're saying.
Okay, that makes sense. So a VPN can help protect me from those rogue Wi-Fi networks we talked about earlier.
Absolutely. If you're using a VPN on a public Wi-Fi network, your traffic is still encrypted even if the network itself is compromised.
So it's like having my own personal bodyguard for my internet connection.
Exactly. A VPN adds an extra layer of security that can make all the difference.
Great. So a VPN is at the top of my list.
Yeah.
What other tips do you have for our listeners?
Well, in addition to using a VPN, it's important to always use strong, unique passwords for all your online accounts.
That's good advice in general, but how does it specifically help with mid-M attacks?
If a hacker manages to intersect your traffic and they don't have your password, they won't be able to access your accounts.
Right, so even if they're listening in, they can't get in without the key.
Exactly. Strong passwords are like a strong lock on your front door. They make it much harder for hackers to break in.
Okay, so strong passwords, check. What else?
Enable multi-factor authentication whenever possible.
I've heard of that, but I'm not really sure what it is.
It's an extra layer of security that requires you to enter a code from your phone or email in addition to your password when you log into an account.
So even if someone steals my password.
They still won't be able to access your account without that second factor of authentication.
Okay, so it's like a double lock on my door.
Exactly. It makes it much harder for hackers to gain unauthorized access.
Sounds like a good idea. I'll definitely be enabling that on all my accounts. What other tips do you have?
Keep all your software up to date.
Oh, yeah. I always get those annoying update notifications.
I know that can be a pain, but those updates often include security patches that fix vulnerabilities that hackers could exploit.
So those updates are actually important.
Absolutely. They're crucial for maintaining your cybersecurity.
Okay, so strong passwords, multi-factor authentication, and keeping things updated. Those are all great tips, but we know our listeners are interested in more than just the basics. What are some of the more advanced tactics that hackers use in MIM attacks? The stuff that keeps cybersecurity experts up at night.
Well, one technique that's particularly concerning is ARP spoofing. ARP stands for Address Resolution Protocol, and it's how computers on a local network figure out each other's MAC addresses.
MAC addresses.
Yeah, think of them like unique identifiers for devices. It's how computers know who's who on the network.
Okay, starting to get a little technical here, but I'm
Uh.
following so far.
In an ARP spoofing attack, a hacker tricks devices on the network into associating their MC address with the IP address of the gateway or router. So essentially, all traffic intended for the router is redirected to the hacker's device instead.
So they're basically impersonating the router.
Exactly. They're becoming the man in the middle by manipulating the way devices communicate on the network.
And because it's happening at a lower level of the network.
It can be very difficult to detect and prevent.
This is starting to feel like we're diving into the deep end of the pool here.
Yeah.
Before we go any further, let's take a moment to talk about the implications of these attacks. We know individuals can be targeted, but what about businesses? They must be prime targets for MIM attacks, right?
Absolutely. Businesses handle vast amounts of sensitive data, making them incredibly attractive targets for hackers seeking financial gain, trade secrets, or even just to cause disruption.
And the methods used against businesses are probably even more sophisticated, right?
Often, yes. We're talking about attacks that go beyond simply stealing passwords on public Wi-Fi. These attackers are using advanced techniques to infiltrate corporate networks and steal sensitive data.
Like what kind of techniques?
Well, one example is email interception and manipulation. Hackers can infiltrate a company's email system and intercept messages containing sensitive information like financial transactions or contracts.
So they could literally steal money from a business by intercepting wire transfers.
Exactly. They could alter the recipient's bank account information or even change the amount of the transfer.
That's scary stuff. It's like becoming a digital puppeteer controlling the flow of information within a company.
It is scary. And it highlights the importance of cybersecurity for businesses of all sizes.
Okay, before we delve further into the business side of things, I want to make sure we're giving our listener a complete picture. What about the human element? How do these attacks affect people on an emotional level? We've talked about the technical side and the financial impact, but what about the personal impact?
That's a really important aspect that often gets overlooked. Being a victim of a cyber attack can be a very traumatic experience. It can make people feel vulnerable, violated, and betrayed.
It's like someone who's been secretly watching and manipulating your every move online.
Exactly. It can be a very unsettling feeling. And the emotional fallout can be significant. People might lose trust in online services, become overly cautious, or even paranoid, or withdraw from online activities altogether.
So it's not just about data and money.
Hmm.
It's about people's sense of security and well-being.
Absolutely. Cybersecurity is about protecting people as much as it's about protecting data and systems.
Well said. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground here today. We've talked about what MIM attacks are, how they work, the techniques hackers use, and the potential consequences for both individuals and businesses.
We've just scratched the surface.
But I think it's a good foundation for our listeners to build on. Now, I know our listeners are eager to learn more about how to protect themselves and their businesses from these attacks. So in our next segment, we'll dive into specific prevention strategies and best practices for both individuals and organizations. Stay tuned.
Looking forward to it.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Ready to talk solutions?
Absolutely. Let's empower our listeners with the knowledge to protect themselves.
I love that. So before the break, we were talking about all these scary ways hackers can use MIM attacks to steal our data, our money, even disrupt businesses.
Yeah, it's definitely unsettling stuff.
But now I think it's time to shift gears and focus on what people can actually do to protect themselves.
Sounds good to me. Let's get practical.
Perfect. So we touched on a few basic tips in the last segment, like using strong passwords, enabling multi-factor authentication, keeping your software updated.
Right, the foundation of good cyber hygiene.
Exactly. But let's dig a little deeper into those individual precautions and maybe dispel some common myths along the way.
Myths. Oh, I love busting myths. Hit me with it.
Okay, so one myth I hear all the time is, I don't need a VPN if I'm not using public Wi-Fi.
Ah, yes, the classic I'm safe at home myth. Unfortunately, it's just not true.
So you're saying even on my home network, I'm still vulnerable?
To a certain extent, yes. While public Wi-Fi is definitely riskier, your home network isn't impenetrable. There are still ways for hackers to get in.
Okay, so a VPN is still a good idea even for home use.
Absolutely. It adds an extra layer of security no matter where you are. Think of it like locking your front door even when you're at home.
Makes sense. You mentioned earlier that a VPN encrypts your traffic and masks your IP address. Can you explain how that actually helps with security?
Sure, your IP address is like your digital fingerprint. It can be used to track your location and your online activity. When you use a VPN, it masks your real IP address and replaces it with the IP address of the VPN server.
So it's like I'm using a fake ID online.
In a way, yes. It makes it much harder for hackers to track your movements or target you with specific attacks.
Okay, that makes sense. What other myths do you encounter when it comes to cybersecurity?
Another one I hear a lot is, my antivirus software will protect me from everything.
Yeah. I think a lot of people have that false sense of security.
It's understandable, but unfortunately, antivirus software isn't a magic bullet. It's good at detecting and removing known malware, but it's not foolproof.
So it's like having a security guard at your front door, but the hacker is sneaking in through a side window.
Exactly. Antivirus is important, but it's just one layer of defense. You need a multi-layered approach that includes a VPN, strong passwords, multi-factor authentication, and vigilance about the websites you visit and the links you click.
Speaking of vigilance, are there any red flags people should be watching out for when they're browsing the web? How can they spot a potentially malicious website?
That's a great question. There are definitely some telltale signs. First, always check the URL carefully. Look for misspellings, unusual characters, or slight variations on legitimate website names.
So like Amazio.com instead of Amazon.com.
Exactly. Hackers often create fake websites that closely resemble real ones to try to trick users into entering their login credentials. It's called typo-squatting.
Typo-squatting. I'll have to remember that one. So always double check the URL. What else?
Pay close attention to the security indicators. We talked about this earlier. Make sure the website uses HTTPS and has a valid SSL certificate. If your browser throws up a warning about the certificate, don't ignore it.
It could be a sign that the website is not legitimate.
Right. And even if a site looks legit, be wary of websites that ask for excessive personal information or pressure you to act quickly. Legitimate businesses rarely operate that way.
Right. If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is.
Exactly. Trust your instincts. If something feels off about a website or an offer, it's best to err on the side of caution and avoid it.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about individual protection, but what about businesses? They're dealing with much larger volumes of sensitive data and often face more sophisticated threats. What steps should they be taking to protect themselves from mid-AM attacks?
For businesses, it's really about taking a comprehensive and proactive approach to cybersecurity. It's not just about installing a few pieces of software and calling it a day.
So it's a bigger picture kind of thing.
Yeah. Exactly. One key aspect is network segmentation. Have you heard of that?
I have, but I'm not sure I fully understand it.
It basically involves dividing your network into smaller, isolated segments. Think of it like building firewalls within your own network.
Okay, so if one part of the network is compromised,
the damage is contained. It prevents hackers from gaining access to the entire network.
So it's like damage control.
Exactly. And it's especially important for businesses to segment sensitive systems, like those containing financial data or customer information, from less critical areas of the network.
Makes sense. What other strategies should businesses be implementing?
Well, intrusion detection and prevention systems are crucial. They monitor network traffic for suspicious activity and can block or alert administrators to potential threats in real time.
So they're like the digital equivalent of security cameras and motion detectors.
Exactly. They provide that extra layer of vigilance that's so important in today's threat landscape.
24/7 surveillance.
Right. And on top of that, strong access controls are essential. Make sure that only authorized personnel have access to sensitive data and systems. Use strong passwords, multi-factor authentication, and regularly review user permissions.
So it's not just about building walls and having to
That's a great way to put it. Of course, regular security audits are essential to identify.
So it's like having a security expert come in and try to break into your system.
Exactly. It's better to find and fix those weaknesses yourself than to wait for a hacker.
Sensing your theme, proactive security seems to be the best defense against these attacks. Anything else businesses should be thinking about?
Absolutely. Employee training is vital. Many successful attacks rely on social engineering techniques like phishing emails or fake websites to trick employees into revealing sensitive information or installing malware.
Right, the human element.
Exactly. Businesses need to educate their workforce about these tactics and empower them to spot and report suspicious activity.
So it's not just about technology, it's about creating a culture of security awareness
Yeah,
within the organization.
absolutely. Your employees can be your strongest asset or your weakest link when it comes to cybersecurity. Make sure they're equipped with the knowledge and skills to make smart decisions and protect your business.
That's a great point. Now, let's say, despite all these precautions, a business does fall victim to a mid-M attack. What should they do? What's the damage control plan?
First and foremost, contain the breach. This might involve isolating affected systems, shutting down certain network services, or even taking the entire network offline temporarily.
So like a digital quarantine.
You could say that the goal is to stop the bleeding and prevent further damage.
Makes sense. Then what?
Then it's crucial to investigate the attack, determine how it happened, and identify any compromised data or systems. This is where forensic experts can be invaluable, helping to piece together the puzzle and uncover the attacker's methods.
So it's like a digital crime scene investigation.
Exactly. You need to understand how the attack happened to prevent it from happening again. Once you've contained the breach and investigated the attack, it's time to start the recovery process.
What does that involve?
It might involve restoring data from backups, resetting passwords, and patching any vulnerabilities that were exploited.
Sounds like a pretty involved process.
It can be, but it's essential to get back up and running securely as quickly as possible. And don't forget about communication.
Right. Keeping everyone informed.
Exactly. Businesses need to be transparent with their customers, employees, and stakeholders about the breach, explaining what happened and what steps are being taken to address the situation. This can help minimize reputational damage and maintain trust.
Honesty and transparency are always the best policies in these situations. Now, we've covered a lot of ground here, from basic individual precautions to complex business security strategies. As we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I'm wondering, are there any emerging trends in mid-M attacks that our listeners should be aware of? What's on the horizon in this ever-evolving landscape?
Oh, the threat landscape is always changing. One trend that's particularly concerning is the increasing use of artificial intelligence, or AI, by hackers.
AI. So the hackers are getting smarter.
You could say that AI can be used to automate attacks, making them more sophisticated and harder to detect. For example, AI-powered phishing attacks can craft highly personalized and convincing emails that are more likely to trick victims into revealing sensitive information.
So it's like the hacker has a team of digital con artists working for them 24/7.
That's a good way to think about it. And AI can also be used to analyze large data sets to identify vulnerabilities or predict the best targets for attacks.
So it's not just about brute force attacks anymore. It's about using intelligence and strategy to find the weakest links and exploit them.
Exactly. And as AI technology continues to advance, we can expect to see even more sophisticated and targeted attacks in the future.
That's a sobering thought. But I'm sure the good guys are using AI to fight back as well, right?
Absolutely. AI is a double-edged sword. It can be used for good or evil. Security researchers and companies are leveraging AI to develop more robust defenses, such as AI-powered intrusion detection systems that can identify and block even the most subtle attack patterns.
So it sounds like the future of cybersecurity is going to be a battle of the bots, with AI playing a pivotal role on both sides.
That's a good way to put it. The battle between attackers and defenders is a constant arms race, with each side trying to outsmart the other. And as technology continues to evolve, the battleground will only become more complex and challenging.
Well, it seems like staying informed and adapting to these new threats is more important than ever. Before we wrap up this deep dive, I'm curious, are there any specific industries that are particularly vulnerable to mid-M attacks or that are seeing a surge in these types of attacks? Are there any industries that should be especially worried?
Well, one industry that's always a prime target is financial services. Banks, payment processors, and other financial institutions handle vast amounts of money and sensitive customer data, making them attractive targets for hackers.
Right, because that's where the money is.
Exactly. And we're seeing a rise in sophisticated mid-M attacks targeting mobile banking apps and online payment platforms as criminals seek to intercept transactions and steal funds.
So it's like the digital equivalent of robbing a bank, except they don't even have to leave their computer.
Precisely. And another industry that's increasingly vulnerable is healthcare. Medical records contain a treasure trove of personal information, including social security numbers, insurance details, and even sensitive health data.
So our health data isn't safe either.
It's a growing concern.
Yeah.
We're seeing more and more attacks targeting healthcare providers and insurance companies as hackers seek to steal this valuable information for identity theft and other fraudulent activities.
It's frightening to think that even our health data is at risk in the digital age. Are there any other industries that are particularly vulnerable?
Critical infrastructure is a major concern. We're talking about systems that control our power grids, water supplies, transportation networks, and other essential services.
Okay, so now we're talking about attacks that could have real-world physical consequences.
Exactly. A successful attack against these systems could cause widespread disruption and even put lives at risk.
So it's not just about stealing money or data anymore. It's about potentially disrupting the very fabric of our society.
That's right. The stakes are higher than ever before. And as our world becomes increasingly interconnected and reliant on technology, the potential impact of these attacks will only continue to grow.
It seems like there's a lot to be concerned about. But I'm also sensing a note of cautious optimism in your voice. Are there any reasons to be hopeful in the fight against these attacks?
Absolutely. While the threats are real and evolving, so are the defenses. Security researchers and companies are constantly developing new technologies and strategies to protect against these attacks. We're seeing advancements in areas like artificial intelligence, quantum cryptography, and blockchain technology that hold great promise for enhancing cybersecurity in the future.
So it's not a losing battle. We're not just sitting ducks waiting to be hacked.
Not at all. We have the tools and the knowledge to protect ourselves. It's all about staying informed, being proactive, and working together to create a more secure digital world.
I like that working together. It seems like cybersecurity is not just an individual responsibility or a business problem. It's a societal challenge that requires a collective effort.
I couldn't agree more. We need to break down silos and share information, collaborate on solutions, and raise awareness about these threats. Cybersecurity is everyone's responsibility, from individuals to businesses to governments. We all have a role to play in creating a safer and more resilient digital ecosystem.
Well, on that note of collective action and shared responsibility, I think it's time to move on to our final part of our deep dive into the world of mid-M attacks. I know I've learned a lot, and I hope our listener has too.
It's been a pleasure sharing my insights.
The pleasure is all ours. Now, before we wrap up, I'd love to hear if you have any real-world examples of mid-M attacks, cases where these attacks have actually happened and what the consequences were, something that will really drive this home for our listeners.
Oh, there are countless examples, unfortunately. But one that stands out is the attack on Target back in 2013. Do you remember that?
Vaguely. It was a big deal, right?
Huge hackers were able to breach Target's network through a third-party vendor and install malware that stole the credit card information of millions of customers.
Millions. Wow. So this wasn't just some small-time operation.
Not at all. It was a massive data breach that had far-reaching consequences. Target faced hefty fines, lawsuits, a major hit to their reputation. It took them years to fully recover.
That's a stark reminder that these attacks are not just theoretical. They have real-world consequences for businesses and individuals alike.
Absolutely. And the methods used by attackers are constantly evolving. We're seeing a shift toward more targeted attacks where hackers are doing their research and focusing on specific individuals or companies.
So it's not just about casting a wide net anymore. It's about spear phishing, going after high-value targets.
Exactly. And these targeted attacks can be incredibly difficult to detect and prevent because they often exploit human vulnerabilities rather than technical weaknesses.
It seems like social engineering is playing an increasingly important role in these attacks.
Absolutely. Hackers are masters of manipulation. They know how to exploit our trust, our curiosity, even our fears, to trick us into giving them access to our systems or our data.
So it's not just about firewalls and antivirus software anymore. It's about educating ourselves and our employees about these social engineering tactics.
Exactly. Cybersecurity awareness training is essential for everyone, from the CEO to the intern. We all need to be aware of the risks and know how to spot the red flags.
It's a shared responsibility. We can't just rely on IT departments or security experts to protect us. We all have a role to play.
I couldn't agree more. Cybersecurity is not just an IT issue. It's a business issue, a societal issue. It affects us all.
Well, on that note of shared responsibility and collective action, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive into the world of mid-M attacks.
It's been a pleasure sharing my insights with you and your listeners.
The pleasure was all ours. Thank you so much for joining us today. And to our listeners, thank you for taking this deep dive with us. We hope you found it informative and empowering. Remember, knowledge is your best defense in the ever-evolving world of cybersecurity. Stay safe out there.
Yeah, that target attack was a wake-up call for a lot of businesses.
Absolutely. It showed that even large, well-established companies with significant resources can be vulnerable to these types of attacks.
And I imagine the impact goes beyond just the financial losses.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
There's the reputational damage, the loss of customer trust, the legal fees.
Yeah.
It can be a real nightmare for a company to deal with. So what can businesses do to prevent these kinds of attacks from happening?
Well, we talked about some key strategies in the last segment, like network segmentation, intrusion detection systems, access controls, employee training. Those are all essential pieces of the puzzle.
Right. It's about taking a layered approach.
Exactly. There's no single silver bullet when it comes to cybersecurity. It's about implementing multiple layers of defense to make it as difficult as possible for hackers to penetrate your systems.
So it's about making yourself a less appealing target.
Precisely. Hackers are always looking for the path of least resistance. If you make it too hard for them, they'll likely move on to an easier target.
That makes sense. So it's not about being perfect. It's about being better than the next guy.
Exactly. And it's about being prepared. You need to have a plan in place for what to do if an attack does occur.
Right. A damage control plan.
Exactly. The faster you can contain a breach, investigate it, and recover from it, the less impact it will have on your business.
So let's talk about that recovery process. What are the key steps involved?
Well, the first step is to isolate the affected systems. You need to contain the damage and prevent the attack from spreading.
Right, like quarantine.
Exactly. Then you need to investigate the attack, figure out how it happened, who was responsible, what data was compromised.
And this is where those forensic experts come in.
Exactly. They can help piece together the digital trail and uncover the attacker's methods.
So once you understand how the attack happened,
You can start to develop a plan for recovery. This might involve restoring data from backups, resetting passwords, patching vulnerabilities.
it sounds like a pretty complex process.
It can be, but it's essential to get back up and running securely as quickly as possible.
And don't forget about communication.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
That's a crucial part of the recovery process. You need to be transparent with your customers, your employees, your stakeholders about what happened and what steps you're taking to address the situation.
Honesty and transparency are key.
Exactly. It's about rebuilding trust and showing that you're taking the situation seriously.
Well, I think this has been an incredibly insightful deep dive into the world of MIDM attacks. We've covered a lot of ground from the technical aspects to the human impact to the prevention strategies.
And we've just scratched the surface.
But I think our listeners now have a much better understanding of the risks and what they can do to protect themselves and their businesses.
I hope so.
So before we sign off, any final words of wisdom you'd like to leave our listeners with?
Stay vigilant, stay informed, and stay curious. The threat landscape is constantly evolving, so it's important to stay ahead of the curve.
Great advice. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It was my pleasure.
And to our listeners, thank you for taking this deep dive with us. We hope you found it informative and empowering. Remember, knowledge is your best defense in the ever-evolving world of cybersecurity.